What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our Week 9 waiver wire ads for the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content or find it helpful, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, it really does help us out if you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. It wasn't necessarily a week with a ton of crazy injuries, but we have a ton of bye weeks coming up here in week 9, so we definitely want to take a sharp look at the waiver wire as we approach the week. So even though there aren't a ton of top tier waiver wire additions for the week, while you guys are navigating maybe previous injuries as well as the week 9 buys, make sure you guys let me know in the comments down below what you guys need. All right, without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, starting with the running back position, here we are again, another week, another Baltimore Ravens running back. This is why I'm, really hesitant when it comes to the Ravens backfield. But in week 8, Gus Edwards left the game towards the end of the game with an injury. He is expected to miss at least a week. It's worth noting that the Ravens have a bye week in week 10, so it's very likely that Gus sits out week 9 and then sits through the bye week as well. Kenyon Drake filled in very nicely for Gus Edwards, finished with 16.7 fantasy points, 62 yards on the ground, 4 receptions, and a receiving touchdown. But really, it's a perfect example, right? Drake had just 0.5 fantasy points in week 7, and in week 6 he had 19.7 fantasy points. His backfield is very volatile. With that being said, I do feel like Drake is a good enough play in week 9, being that Edwards is very likely to miss the week against the New Orleans Saints. Drake is definitely worth a waiver in the aspect that you can plug him in as an RB2 or a flex if you are hurting at the position moving into the week. All right, let's take a look at Latavius Murray, who finished week 8 with 12.9 fantasy points, 46 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and a reception for 13 receiving yards. Listen, at the end of the day, Latavius Murray was the lead back if we're going by overall touches between him and Melvin Gordon. Okay, 14 touches for Latavius Murray, 2 targets, and a reception. When we look at Melvin Gordon, 9 touches on the ground and 4 targets, 3 receptions. So it's still relatively close, don't get me wrong, but it just felt like Latavius Murray, even if he didn't feel like the lead back, he was a closer for this team, right? This is a guy they relied on when the game was on the line. So there's still going to be a little bit of a split here, don't get me wrong, but Latavius Murray at this point in the season is absolutely worth a look. Worth noting that the Broncos are headed into a bye week in week 9, but overall Murray is still a player to take a deep look at. All right, let's talk about the Falcons running backs. We have Caleb Huntley, who had a really strong performance on the ground at 91 rushing yards off of 16 touches, 5.69 yards per carry, but just 9.1 fantasy points because he did not score a touchdown. But we have to keep an eye on Huntley because the bulk of the carries went to Huntley on the day. With that being said, Tyler Algier still had 14 touches on the ground, 3 targets, 3 receptions. So overall, if we're including the receiving game, Tyler Algier saw more work, and more importantly, he scored a touchdown. So he had 17.5 fantasy points in full PPR scoring formats. On top of that, the Falcons will face the Chargers next week, who are in the bottom 5 against the running back position from a fantasy perspective. So both of these running backs are worth a look, especially if you're struggling with the bye weeks as we move in to week 9. All right, we need to talk about the Rams backfield. It was Ronnie Rivers. I heard some buzz about Rivers going in the week, but I just wasn't confident to really pull the trigger. And at the end of the day, he had just 7.6 fantasy points, but 8 touches, 21 yards on the ground, 4 targets, 4 receptions. Darrell Henderson had just 5 fantasy points, 4 touches on the ground, 2 targets, 2 receptions. So if you want to stash Rivers, I do think you can do so overall, but I think at the end of the day, Kyron Williams is still the running back to stash, quote unquote, for the LA Rams. But let's face it, this offense is struggling. Cooper Kupp could potentially miss a week or 2. They get Tampa Bay in week 9. It's not a great matchup for these running backs, but looking ahead to the end of the season, you've got some good matchups like week 13 Seattle, week 14 Las Vegas. So there's definitely And actually, week 17, they faced the Chargers as well, who we just talked about being the bottom 5 in the league. But there are some tough matchups in there. Regardless, if you want to stash a Rams running back, I think Kyron Williams is still the move. But Ronnie Rivers was still involved in this game plan for the Rams. Okay, Chuba Hubbard got dropped in a lot of fantasy leagues because he was ruled out in week 8. And even before he was ruled out, we knew that he was dealing with an ankle injury and was going to be Foreman's backfield in week 8. But I do think we can start to take a look at Chuba Hubbard going to be facing the Cincinnati Bengals in week 9, then the Atlanta Falcons and Baltimore Ravens. So some decent game scripts there for a team that is a complete underdog, but is definitely fighting for the respect of the rest of the league. I mean, PJ Walker had a nice day, DJ Moore had a nice day, Foreman had a nice day, and then we saw Chuba Hubbard get a lot of involvement in week 7. So I think if Chuba got dropped in your league, he's definitely worth a look as we move into week 9. All right, moving on to the wide receiver position. It's a tough week for waiver wire adds at the receiver position. Let's talk about the Kansas City Chiefs receiving room outside of Juju Smith-Schuster. Mecole Hardman is rostered in this 41% of fantasy leagues. He's actually my favorite addition. Obviously, the Chiefs were on bye week in week 8, so nothing to really go off of here, except week 7, Mecole Hardman had 28 fantasy points. He had a monster week. And in week 7, MVS, the other receiver we want to take a look at, right, had 14.1 fantasy points. Beginning of the year, the receiver position for the Chiefs was just not consistent at all. But in the last few weeks, these receivers really started to show a lot of production within this offense, and more importantly, they did not get picked up in a lot of leagues because they're on bye week in week 8. So Mecole Hardman and MVS, in my opinion, with how bleak things look at the receiver position this week, are definitely top waiver additions as we move into week 9. All right, let's talk about Rondale Moore, who is rostered in just 50% of fantasy leagues. It probably should be a little bit higher, right? Does Moore bring some boomer bust potential on a weekly basis? Yes, absolutely, but he absolutely boomed. And week 8 at 23.4 fantasy points, 8 targets, 7 receptions, 92 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Easily his best fantasy performance of the season. The Cardinals will face Seattle in a very important game in week 9. I think Moore could be a huge part of this game script and this game plan, I should say. So Rondale Moore, absolutely worth a waiver wire look. Only rostered 50% of fantasy leagues is kind of crazy to me. All right, let's talk about Devin Duvernay, rostered in 49% of fantasy leagues at the moment. 16.4 fantasy points in week 8, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 31 receiving yards. On top of that, added 2 carries for 33 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. The Ravens will face the Saints in week 9. It's pretty good game script overall there, but more importantly, Rashad Bateman missed time in week 8 and Mark Andrews missed time in week 8, so that could open up more opportunities for Devin Duvernay, who at times in the season has done well when Bateman and or Andrews is out, and at other times the season has not done so well. But at the end of the day, Duvernay, rostered in 49% of fantasy leagues, is a top 22 receiver in full PPR right now. He should definitely be considered, especially with how many bye weeks we've got moving in to the week. All right, let's talk about Josh Palmer of the Chargers, and we might as well mention DeAndre Carter as well, right? Both of these receivers on bye week in week 8. The reason we want to take a look at both of these receivers because Mike Williams is going to miss week 9. At least that's what all the reports are indicating. And Keenan Allen, although he is probably going to be good to go in week 9, even though he's been dealing with a hamstring injury for what feels like the entire season. Always some injury risk there. So Palmer and Carter should see an uptick in volume overall, and they get the Atlanta Falcons in week 9. One of the worst teams in the entire league against the wide receiver position. So if you're struggling, you need a desperate flex play, Josh Palmer is who I like, but DeAndre Carter is another name to take a look at in terms of the Chargers receivers moving in to the week. All right, last but not least, we've got Zay Jones rostered in 38% of fantasy leagues. Not a crazy game overall whatsoever in week 8 against Denver. 6.5 fantasy points, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 28 receiving yards. The Jaguars will face the Las Vegas Raiders in week 9. It's a good game script. This is more of a desperate flex play. Like I said, it is a rough week for the wide receiver position. So if there are wide receivers out there that you guys are considering, please let me know in the comment section down below, because man, it is absolutely bleak at the position as we move into week 9. All right, let's finish things off with the quarterback and the tight end position. All right, Justin Fields, I told you guys, a good performance in week 5, better performance in week 6, a very strong performance in week 7 against New England. But I was very worried about Justin Fields and the Bears going up against the Dallas Cowboys defense in week 8. But I did say, if he plays well in this game, he is going to be a must-add player going into the following weeks. And he had his best fantasy performance of the year against the Dallas Cowboys defense. 26 fantasy points on the day, 151 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 60 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. No turnovers for Justin Fields. He gets the Miami Dolphins in week 9, the Detroit Lions in week 10, and the Atlanta Falcons in week 11. These next 3 weeks look golden for Justin Fields from a fantasy perspective. He is absolutely at the quarterback position your top waiver priority. If you have a quarterback on bye week in week 9, he is undoubtedly your top waiver wire priority going into the week. But seriously, for the rest of the season, Justin Fields could hold a lot of fantasy value. There are some tough matchups on the year. Don't get me wrong. Week 12, he gets the Jets. Week 15, he gets Philly. Week 16, he gets Buffalo. But there is enough here, including the Detroit Lions in week 17, where a majority of you guys will be playing your fantasy championships, that Justin Fields going into week 9 feels like a must-add player, maybe the most must-add player on today's list. All right, Andy Dalton, 17 fantasy points against the Las Vegas Raiders. Nothing crazy here, but 229 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. It was a good, solid, safe floor type of day. He gets Baltimore in week 9. It's a good overall matchup if you need to stream a quarterback as we move into the week. Marcus Mariota had himself a nice day as well. 24.4 fantasy points, 253 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 43 yards on the ground, and 2 interceptions. Good day overall. No, it was his best fantasy performance of the year. He gets the Chargers in week 9. Should be a pretty favorable game script overall if you need to stream a quarterback. Jared Goff had a decent day as well. I want to mention I liked him all week as a streaming option at 18.6 fantasy points against Miami, and in a week where we saw Trevor Lawrence and Daniel Jones really disappoint overall in terms of guys that we've been able to stream earlier in the season. I still have some faith in Danny Dimes moving forward, but overall we needed some other options. So Goff gets the Packers in week 9. We got Mariota, Andy Dalton, and absolutely Justin Fields at the quarterback position as we approach week 9. Looking at the tight end position, we got some very solid play out. Some of my top streaming options going into week 8. Evan Ingram had 15.5 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 55 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He gets a very solid matchup in week 9 against the Las Vegas Raiders. Very, very favorable. They've been very bad against the tight end position. Ingram feels like a must-add and a player who could bring some productivity throughout the remainder of the year, not just week 9. Speaking of a player who's going to bring a lot of productivity throughout the year, Greg Dulcich had another double-digit fantasy performance in week 8. That makes 3 in a row in full PPR scoring formats. He's on bye in week 9. I don't really care. You guys have been struggling at the tight end position. Greg Dulcich is probably the last, productive tight end in terms of the remainder of the season who we can trust that you can pick up on the waiver wire. We've talked about in the last 2 weeks. This is probably your last chance to go out and get him. I think he's a very solid add. He's rostered in 47% of fantasy leagues. We need to make that number a little bit higher as we approach week 9. All right, we talked about Mark Andrews potentially missing some time. Guys, listen, it's a long week for the Ravens. They don't play until Monday night, but they do have a bye week in week 10. So I could see a circumstance where Andrews sits in week 9 if he needs to. Could also see a circumstance where he plays because he's Mark Andrews, right? But likely filled in very, very nicely for Mark Andrews. 19.7 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 receptions, 77 receiving yards, and a score. This could be a little bit dependent on Mark Andrews' health, don't get me wrong, but I do think that likely is absolutely worth an addition and or a stash as we approach week 9. All right, Robert Tonyan is still playing football at the time I'm recording this, but I'm not really going off of his performance in week 8. I'm going off of the matchup in week 9 against the Detroit Lions, who just gave up a big day to Mike Gesicki. They are a defense we can stream opposing tight ends against because they play very, very poorly against the tight end position. So if you're desperate, I think Robert Tonyan is a very nice waiver wire add and or a very good stream as we approach week 9. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, it really does help us out. If you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. Like I said, guys, it's a tough week in terms of the waiver wire overall. So if you guys are struggling with your decisions, please let me know in the comment section down below. On top of that, still got a lot of lingering injuries, and we still have a lot of teams on bye week here in week 9. So let me know what you guys need in the comment section down below. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.